my name is Sarah, and today is my first group of reviews and previews of my 100 Books in 100 Days 2021. If you want more information on why I'm doing this and what this is, go and check out my last video where I lay out essentially an introduction of what 2021's version of 100 Books in 100 Days looks like. Overall, this week was kind of lackluster. I had a ton of 3-star reviews, which is actually pretty disappointing. I was looking forward to a lot of the books on my list, and I think the real lesson I learned from this is I can't do too many literary fiction books in the same group of time. There's a number of these books that probably could have been 4-star books for me under the right circumstances. However, literary fiction book after literary fiction book after literary fiction book does start to weigh on me. I'm starting to realize about myself, I am just not somebody who can really wade through the myths of literary fiction. There is a lot of times that I just need the direct messages of what's happening to which character and a straight linear plot line. So to start on a high note, I'm going to start by talking about my favorite books of this group. And I kind of feel like a cheater because my one 5-star book of my first group is Red Rising. This is a reread for me and a series I know I absolutely love. I noticed a lot more of just little pieces. Coming back around and seeing Severo for the first time was such a cool moment for me. I really got to enjoy and sit in those experiences with Cassius, with Rogue, and really start looking for kind of the markers of what you'll eventually see out of those different characters going later in the series. And now this wasn't my first time rereading the beginning of Red Rising. It was probably the time that I most enjoyed the original passage. I feel like the first time when I read Red Rising, going through and learning about the Red Society was a lot more of a slog than it was this time around. After going through and learning much more about the world and how all the different pieces fit together really makes me appreciate that time that we get to spend learning about the Quadra, that time that we get to spend with Io and Diana. All these people that will eventually make such an impact later in the series, getting and sitting down with them was a really great opportunity. Now I had 3 4-star reviews for this group, the first of which is Lord of the Flies by William Golding. I really enjoyed my reread of this book. I liked it so much more this time around than I did in high school. And honestly, I think reading it back to back with Red Rising was really, really helpful. You can definitely see how Lord of the Flies really set the stage for a lot of younger dystopian books that would come more in the 2010s era. In general, the story itself was really awesome. I didn't remember how visceral a lot of the scenes were. In particular, there was a couple really violent scenes towards the end of the book. And with one of my favorite characters that it was really sad because it was oh God, that's a really bad end to meet. This time around, I also was able to understand more that these characters aren't meant to be attached to. You're not supposed to get yourself really emotionally involved with Ralph or Piggy or Simon. These are characters that are meant to be stand-ins for general themes in society, not so much that you're supposed to really care about them like you do Darrow out of Red Rising or Katniss out of The Hunger Games. My next 4-star review is for Scarlet by A.C. Guggen. I thought this was a really cool Robin Hood retelling, and the fact that they made Will Scarlet was a really fun twist. In general, the action kept going from start to finish, and the twists that they did have throughout the novel made sense, were well markered, you could guess them, but they were still fun. And those are my favorite types of twists. The characters had pretty good characterizations, they had a nice arc. The 2 quick things that did really bother me, there was a language thing that they did from the perspective of Scarlet that just got a little bit grating at times. In general, I don't really care that much when authors use interesting grammar for their narration. However, when you start taking it too far, it really gets on my nerves. For example, I was not able to ever finish Clockwork Orange just because of how incomprehensible the text itself was. And this wasn't nearly that bad, but it still just got a little bit grating. The second piece was, there's a love triangle in this. That's not my favorite, and personally I could have really done without it. But otherwise, I feel overall this book was really, really well done, and in general the romance is kind of played down anyhow, so it's not much of a concern. My final 4-star review is Ariadne by Jennifer Saint. Overall, this was a pretty good retelling of the Theseus myth. And I did enjoy, in general, how well written it was. I feel like it had a very good way of bringing the reader into the story, of introducing some of the most interesting Greek myths that there are. I think the one thing that did take it down from a 5-star read for me was the fact that sometimes it felt really heavy on the exposition. And even though it was cool that you wove in all these disparate Greek myths together, for somebody who is like a Greek literature lover, it just got like kind of repetitive at some times. Like I just wanted to get on with it. I wanted to get back to the story itself instead of having all these like side pieces where you had to go and like, okay, here's this myth. As somebody who's read a bunch of Greek literature, I didn't necessarily need all that background, although it was pretty cool that they did it. It might be more enjoyable for somebody who is just dipping their toes into Greek mythology. Now on to my 3-star reviews. The first 3-star review I have is The Midnight Lie by Marie Rutkowski. This book has so much promise. In general, the magic system was really interesting. I really liked the main character at the start. However, there was just a lot of political maneuvering and not much action. I felt like I kept waiting for the ball to drop and for like things to really kick it into high gear, and it just never came. And that was kind of disappointing because I felt like the book could have really benefited from that. My second kind of thing that like bothered me was, in general, the main character felt Mary Sue-ish at some points. She was just way too good for the story itself. There were people that were very much taking advantage of her, and the fact that she could just never get her mind around the fact that like these people are bad for you and are clearly taking advantage of you got a little bit grating at times, because you're just like, please use your head. This is not a good situation for you, and you need to like care about yourself for once, girl. All that to say, the magic system really brought it back for me. The lore around it really brought it back for me. Just not enough to give it a 4-star review. This was a solid 3-star, but if you're somebody who doesn't need a ton of action, you might enjoy this book more. My second 3-star review was And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie. This was a cool mystery thriller. In general, I can see how this set the stage for so many later works, and I'm very glad that I read it. However, there was just way too many characters for me to keep them all straight. I got the overall premise of the book, but I just couldn't remember which one was which, and you didn't spend enough time with each individual characters to really kind of care. Like we got like this huge exposition dump at the beginning explaining each of these individual characters as they're coming onto the island. But after that, I couldn't connect which one was which, and like it didn't give me enough time to really care about them. My next 3-star review was The Second Rebel by Lyndon Lewis. This was the follow-up to the first sister book that I read a little while ago. In general, I felt like this book fell flat for me. The author was trying to make this really, really big universe with all these different political machinations, which is cool, but it felt like it didn't totally go through correctly. Even as somebody who like paid attention and really cared about the first book, I could not keep straight all the different political factions. And the fact that you had so many characters flip-flopping and changing between them was really hard to keep track of. I feel like this was also a symptom of having way too many narration point of views. I feel like this series would have done a lot better picking 1, maybe 2 points of views and doing first-person perspective from them, just so that you can get the audience a little bit more engaged with what's actually happening. I couldn't keep straight which political faction was which, why we cared, and what each person was doing. There was just too much happening for me to really care about any of it. Which was sad, because in general I feel like the world building was pretty solid, and it was really right up my alley if it was just done a little bit better. Kind of still going along those same lines, the next 3-star review I have is for No Gods, No Monsters by Cadwell Turnbull. I actually watched an interview on this author right before making this review, and I felt like that added a lot more to the story, and I kind of got it a little bit more after that interview from the author. However, I want to rate this book based on my initial reaction versus having that background, because I get his overall message from the book, and I thought it was really interesting. I mean, he did make werewolves and all other sorts of monsters, like kind of literary fiction. He did that well. The voice on this book was fantastic, and he didn't make it feel cheesy, which was really cool to see, because as somebody who does like the lore around vampires and werewolves and all sorts of monsters, it's kind of sad that you only see those types of lores in like more lower tier books. It was cool to see a truly elevated werewolf story. However, I think he spent a lot more time focusing on getting his overall message through versus trying to get each of the individual character lines to make sense and to explain what was really happening in a practical sense to the reader. If you don't care so much about character development and stuff like that, I think this is still a great book. But it just, be aware there are a lot of characters, there's a lot of moving pieces, and it goes really, really quickly with a main focus mostly on the theme instead of the plot. My next 3-star review is Matrix by Lauren Goff. It centers around, I think it's like a 12th century nun who comes from an abbey. And maybe this is just because I don't really care about like medieval / early English history, but I didn't care that much about what was happening. The main character was interesting, her kind of struggles to fit in, to make her way, to gain power in a system that really is designed to keep her in a low place was very interesting, and I appreciate everything that was going on there. But the main setup was, it was just kind of convoluted. I didn't care after a while, and I was mostly just like kind of trying to get through, which was sad and really not how I wanted to do this book. But I think that was a little bit also of just literary fiction hangover of too many books that were like taxing my brain a little bit too much. My final review is for The Future Home of the Living God by Louise Erdrich. This was another one that like had promise, and I really feel like if the author had focused more on like the dystopian setup for this and like the trickle-down effects of like her premise, the book would have been much better. But unfortunately, like the first part of it's like mainly focused on the main character's like reconnecting with her biological family after being adopted, which is cool, interesting story. But I came here for a dystopian novel. And then the second part of it just really feels like The Handmaid's Tale. Once you start getting into like the actual dystopian story itself, and it's like, I didn't necessarily need to be retold that. And then the ending just kind of sputtered out, and it just left me like really lacking. Like there was so much to go off here. I felt like in general the premise was right there, but they just stumbled over the line really, and it could have been done so much better. With all that said though, I'm really looking forward to my next group of books. So really quickly, I'm just going to list off what my second group of 10 will be. So my second group of 10 is going to start off with Sky Hunter by Marie Lu. This is a YA sci-fi fantasy novel that I'm super excited about. It sounds like it kind of has a dystopian tilt to it. I think it'll be really cool. The next book that I'm going to read is The Amazons by Adrienne Mayer. This is a nonfiction book essentially going through the history of the legendary Amazons of the Scythian Plains. A while back I read a book on specifically the Scythians in general, and that was incredibly interesting to me, and I feel like a really under-talked about part of ancient history. The next book I'm going to talk about is The Love Hypothesis by Ali Hazelwood. This looks like a really fun contemporary romance novel, and I'm like really kind of excited about it. It has kind of a sciencey twist. I understand it's enemies to lovers, and I'm really pumped about it. It has a fun cover, so I'm excited. My next book is For the Wolves by Hannah Witten. This is a Red Riding retelling with a heavy dose of fantasy added in, so I think it'll be cool to continue adding more to my retelling repertoire. My next book is My Heart a Chainsaw by Stephen Graham Jones. This is a horror book that really capitalizes on horror themes from my understanding. As someone who's like starting to dip their toes into more and more horror, I thought it would be really cool to do this going into Halloween type time frame. My next book is Sorrowland by River Solomon. I read The Deep by River Solomon last year. I pretty well enjoyed it. I thought it was interesting. So looking forward to this book. Supposedly it's science fiction. My next book is Iron Widow by Chiran J. Zhao. I really hope I said that right. It is a science fiction book with like almost sounding like Transformer-sized bots that are controlled by people. And based on the summary, the lore kind of around it is that each robot is piloted by two people, a boy and a girl. And oftentimes the girls are kind of more likely to die in these scenarios. And then in comes our protagonist, based off of the only Chinese female emperor, Wu Zetian. I really liked finding out about Wu Zetian, like the real person, so I'm really interested how this author works that into horror story in a more updated setting. My next book is Milk Fed by Melissa Border. This is a literary fiction novel, which I'm hoping by the time I'm getting to this, I'll have a little bit more patience for. The narrator is a young Jewish woman who is recovering from an eating disorder, living her life in LA. Finally, I have two really short nonfiction books that are basically about ancient times that I'm really, really excited about. The first is Gnosticism. This is compiled by the Charles River editors, and essentially it's a brief introduction on this sect of Christianity that died out thousands of years ago. My final book is Spartacus and the Slave Wars by Hourly History. I've been super interested in the time period between about 100 BC to 100 AD in ancient Rome, and one of the most overlooked situations that happened during that time is the rebellion sparked by Spartacus. So I'm excited to have this opportunity to learn more about this specific instance instead of just getting like drive-by references to it that I usually get in other history books. So thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. If you've read any of these books, I'd love to discuss down below. If you have any recommendations for any of my other groups, please also let me know down below. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a great day.